I'm Victor Cooperman. I work at McMaster as an associate professor of linguistics. And I just wanted to say a few words about the goal of this series of training events and, of course, introduce our today's speaker. So the mandate of the Words in the World Partnership is to train a new generation of leaders in language sciences. And we emphasize in this endeavor, we emphasize the world component because we want our field to show both academic excellence and serve the urgent social, economic, cultural, and healthcare needs. Now, since most of the training that we as faculty can give takes place in academic settings in universities, it is important that we, both the faculty and the trainees, get to learn about language-related challenges in different walks of life, occupations, and social contexts. So we see these events as an opportunity to learn about these and brainstorm ways in which language research can help solve these challenges. Today's event will introduce us as language researchers to a complex of needs and issues in one very important, crucial professional setting and institution, the Canadian Armed Forces. So it is our pleasure and privilege to welcome today Ms. Sandra Plante, who is the program evaluator for the Canadian Forces Health Services Training Center. And in this capacity, she evaluates the efficacy and efficiency of training programs for healthcare professionals within the defense team. She has over 30 years of experience in national defense and holds a Bachelor of Education in Adult Education with a specialization in psychology and a Master's of degree in specializing in education and digital technologies. So I welcome you, Ms. Sandra Plante, to this event, and I encourage everyone to listen carefully and with much interest to what we're about to hear, and of course to brainstorm and ask questions after the session. This is an interactive event, which is something that Ms. Plante has emphasized many times in our previous discussions, and let's make it so interactive. Thanks again and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm just gonna share my screen. Let's see if it worked before I started. Let's see if it's still working. Can I get a thumbs up if everybody can see that okay?
Yeah, it works fine.
Awesome, that's fabulous. I'm just gonna turn my chat on so I can see that. And I have a moderator, so that's great. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Cooperman, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, both to share our journey and our issues in language integration in healthcare training within the Canadian Armed Forces, but also I look forward to learning from what you have to guide us and to guide myself as a program evaluator as I look at our programs and see repetitively this issue of things coming up with regards to language. So with that, I'll just kick off. So health services in the CAF, just a few images here of some of the austere environments in which our clinicians practice, and also some pictures of some of the typical clinical experiences that you would come to expect from a healthcare professional. So our home station, and that's Canadian Forces Health Services Training Center, we are located in Canadian Forces Base Borden, which is about 90 minutes north of Toronto. And we refer to ourselves as the home station because at some point, all of our healthcare professionals will come here for their training. And they may have to come back for further training, just depending on the situation. But most of the healthcare professionals within the Canadian Armed Forces will at some point come to this building and complete some of their training. So what occupations are we looking at? In both medical and dental fields, we have a wide variety of healthcare practitioners, as well as administrators and researchers in our bioscience folks. And we also have 3 occupations that are highlighted in red. And the reason I've highlighted those ones is because those are the occupations for which our institution creates their occupation from the ground up. So for our physicians, for example, nurses, dentists, etc., they come to our training center already degreed or diplomaed with license or certification of practice in their respective fields. For the ones that are in red, it's our responsibility to bring them from basic knowledge all the way up to the point where they have a Bachelor of Science conferred upon them for some, and they're then able to practice. So it changes the scope of what we train. For the other clinicians that come to us already qualified, what we do is we cover how to take what they know how to do in their field of practice and migrate that into a military environment so that they can be effective on overseas and domestic operations. That's our mission. I'll just give you a moment to read through that. Something I just wanted to point out, since this is an audience of linguistic specialists, our Canadian Armed Forces environment, we have our own vocabulary that's very unique and germane to ourselves, and we tend to use it all the time. You may hear me say the word CAF. When I talk about CAF, I'm referring to the Canadian Armed Forces. We love our acronyms, we love our abbreviations. It's really its own language. So I like to say that I'm trilingual, and I throw in the fact that I can speak military as well. So something to bear in mind. If at any point I've used a term that you're unsure, feel free to throw it in the chat, and I'll address that and make sure that I'm clarifying what I mean by that. So a little bit about our courses. I'm just going to move some out of the way here so I can see. So they range anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years in duration. That's quite a broad scope. It really depends on the occupation, the level of training that is required. And again, there's those ones in red that I spoke of where we have to start them from cradle to grave, so to speak, of their educational journey. Typically, for each of the occupations, we'll have 1 to 2 sessions per year. And our format tends to be online or residential or a blend of both. So online, of course, being at home, residential being where they come to the building. And our class sizes range between 4 students and 30 students. And those numbers are typically driven by a couple of factors, one being how many people are actually waiting for the training, and the second most limiting factor being how many people can we actually fit into a classroom or a training environment at one time. So if our desk capacity in a classroom is 30, then our maximum load becomes 30. And oftentimes because of that, there's long waiting periods for training, and I'll touch on that a bit more. Most of the training, or most of the people who attend our training also will be away from their homes and their loved ones for the duration. So just a little bit about what it's like to be a member of the military and be in training. A little bit about the living environment. There you see a typical sterile looking barrack room that they may be living in. Sometimes we have them in outdoor tents, and this is popular, or not popular, but common on deployment. They have cafeteria type messing. Everybody eats together as a group. Tend to socialize together. You see here that it's rather empty looking. This is probably a post-COVID type of picture of one of our social clubs. And then of course, everybody will also, we have leisure time together. Sports are huge in our environment. So it's very immersive when they come in on course. The learning environment, well, you see everything from typical classroom, what you would come to expect in a learning environment, to clinical practice, where we have something that looks more like a ward, like you would see in a hospital, and we do a lot of simulation. Sometimes we take it outside, try to simulate the environmental context in which they'll practice and operations. And of course, we always have to bear in mind that we have to bring things back to those basic soldiering skills to make sure that our clinicians can practice in a tactical environment and be safe and maintain patient safety. Unfortunately, now with COVID, this is more what our learning environment is looking like right now, but we're learning to adapt and overcome. So our demographics, well, basically, we get our members from the Canadian population. So really, we reflect the diversity that you see every day in Canada. So that's from a cultural linguistic diversity as well. We see that in the Canadian Armed Forces. So in looking at this, I dug in to do a little bit of research to see what the demographics were from a language perspective. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but probably are, because this is your field of practice, not mine, but we have English as 58% of the population reporting on the 2016 census that this is the language that they spoke at home. Now, the next two numbers, interestingly, French actually was lower than our immigrant population for language spoken at home, yet French and English are the two official languages of Canada. So interesting that the numbers are slightly higher for the immigrant language, but in the Canadian Forces, we tend to have the most difficulty with our French members who are unilingual French. So they tend to be the ones who are the most underserved. And perhaps that's because that's what we're seeing more so than the immigrant population. I'm not sure. We have more francophones that we tend to be recruiting as opposed to allophone members. That's a whole other topic of conversation for a different day as to why that is. But from a linguistic standpoint, a lot of the language issues that we tend to deal with are mostly French integration, followed by managing the allophone integration. Interesting to note, when a member is recruited into the Canadian Forces, they would declare their language, their first official language of either French or English at recruiting. And they are forced into a choice of either French or English. So basically what tends to happen, if they're not a native language, either French or English, they would have to pick one of those two. And that is what the majority or all of their training will be in. So sometimes it underrepresents what their needs are, and that's one of the issues that we'd like to discuss here today as well. And of course, we have our Aboriginal language at a very small percentage. There are certain programs in the Canadian Rangers, for example, that's a member of the Canadian Forces, that does cater directly to that population group. So for today, what I wanted to do to talk about language issues was to look at our current state, where we're at, versus where we would like to be, and then sort of look at how we can close that gap to get our current state closer to our desired state. So let's go into the current state. So right now, with respect to language integration, our francophones tend to wait a very long time for French courses. So I would say that a lot of times the wait is usually 1 to 2 years in duration, which is an extreme dissatisfier, particularly for a member who may be brand new in and is waiting to get training in order to be job effective and carry on with their career. They tend to end up in a case of being stuck in limbo for a long period. Because of that, a lot of francophones will opt for English courses just to expedite their training, but they're often underserved from a learning standpoint. We tend to use a lot of Franco Assist, we call it. And what that looks like is a francophone sitting in the classroom while all of the lecture is conducted in English. And somebody who's bilingual would sit next to them and provide clarification in real time as needed. So it could be whispering in their ear or just clarifying what was said by the instructor. It tends to be distracting, both for the instructor and for the other students. And it's also very difficult for the learner themselves because they're often a few minutes behind the pace of the lesson. We also have quite a lack of suitably qualified francophone instructional staff. And there's a very high burnout rate with our francophone instructional staff because we have so few numbers, we're always relying on them to come in and teach more so than the other staff. And we burden them with additional responsibilities, such as doing Franco Assist, such as translating courseware that maybe got changed last minute and we couldn't send out for translation. So they report a lot of dissatisfaction and high burnout rates. On the job, the language, the technical language is often anglicized. So we find a lot of our francophones tend to use English terminology. So the core structure of the sentencing is French, with the key terms being the English version. That sometimes causes confusion if they've been working for a while and then they come on course and they have to now relearn the vocabulary and the proper terminology. because it's a French course. We also have a very compressed training model. So as I stated earlier, our courses run anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years. During that time frame, our students are in the classroom or they're in a learning environment for typically 6 hours a day, 5, sometimes 6 days a week. That's a lot of learning time, a lot of saturation, for especially if you're in a second language. It's very cognitively demanding and overwhelming. And the last point on our current situation with language integration is our translation costs, which are astronomical. So courseware, lesson material, PowerPoints such as this have to be translated. We get them done professionally to improve the quality for the sake of the Francophones. And anytime there's changes or updates, we have to pay to have those done as well. So our annual budget costs are quite high. Language training. So what we do at Health Services Training Center in Borden, we do not engage in actual language training. It's all occupational training. There is in the Canadian Forces language training available, and it's held at various locations throughout our bases in Canada. So for example, if I wanted to study French, it's quite possible I could learn how to do it in Shearwater, Nova Scotia. Part of the problem with that, though, is that if I'm learning another language and I'm not in a milieu where that language is spoken outside of the classroom, it's very difficult to reinforce those skills. The format of our language training is most commonly e-learning is the most easily accessible. We do have some class time, in-class programs, full and part-time. They range anywhere from 3 weeks to a 1-year immersive program. And again, we have limited follow-on professional development of those linguistic skills. Often it's location dependent. If you're fortunate enough to learn French and go to a French base, then you're able to apply it better. It's easier actually for our Francophones learning English because the majority of the bases are Anglophone and the environment is predominantly English. So they actually have a better advantage at reinforcing those language skills. Our academic resources, our official publications and our policies are always available in both official languages. That's a requirement for the Government of Canada. Where we run into issues are the external resources. So any textbooks or anything that we may need for the purpose of our training or our education programs, they're often only in English, or if we find one in French, it doesn't quite cover the content in a similar fashion to the English one. So in trying to keep everything standardized, we end up having to sometimes pay money to have textbooks translated, which is very expensive. Also, from an academic resources, our healthcare professionals, that we have very limited funding available for them to attend conferences and continuing education. So it's sometimes difficult for them to get a lot of professional guidance or pearls of wisdom from within their field of practice because they don't often have the same opportunities to attend conferences and hear what's happening in the field of practice. And because of all those things, we sometimes have a difficulty with cultural buy-in. What I mean with that is a lot of times our members in uniform can look at stuff coming out of conferences or other non-military type of academia and feel like, well, that's all well and good, but it's not reflective of our environment. So, it's not going to work here. So we often have to try and overcome that prejudice that sometimes comes from the total immersion that tends to happen with being a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. So now that we talked about the current state, let's go into looking at the desired state. Where would we like to be? Well, with language integration, we would like to have sufficient French sessions for our members, especially those who are waiting an extended period of time. If we're unable to do that for whatever reason, sometimes if you only have 2 members, it's not worth running a session for, especially in some cases where we need a minimum amount to be able to do the simulations properly. The alternative would be to have fully bilingual courses where the content is delivered either in the classroom at the same time bilingually, or perhaps in syndicates where one syndicate is French and one is English. But an ideal situation would be to have the capacity to be able to do that. And also possibly to maybe use simultaneous translation. I know there are many apps and stuff available with that. I think it's a burgeoning technology. I'm not sure how it would manage in an environment in real time in learning. I would welcome information for anyone who has experience in that, but something that we could look at, and that would be a desired state. Also, adequate support for our allophone learners, and I talked about them earlier, and again, not to push them to the side, we just don't see them quite as much, but oftentimes we're so used to dealing with the French-English dichotomy that when we have somebody come in who really struggles in both of those languages, we're at a loss of what to do to help them. And we really need to be able to support those learners as best we can. So a desired state for our language training, it would be great to have the Francophones who need it, where we know they're going to be in an English environment, and our allophones who perhaps are not fluent in either language, have access to language training prior to the occupational training. It tends to be in our model that those courses, being able to speak both official languages, is very crucial to promotion and career development. So oftentimes you see that the people who get into these courses are further down in their career and are earmarked for higher level positions. So to sort of reverse that a little bit and maybe make it available to people at the outset would help them in integrating in at those earlier years during their career. And also a desired state would be to have opportunities to improve our linguistic ability in English or French, much like I talked about earlier. If we give somebody French training or English training, post them to a unit where they're going to be using it even outside of the working environment. If the context they're living in is in that second language, it's going to further reinforce that. The pitfall to this, though, unfortunately, is because there's often more at stake here than just the member themselves. They usually have a family or loved ones or other considerations that to send them to a unilingual Franco environment would be very detrimental to their family situation, potentially. But that would be a desired state for us to be at. From our academic resources, a desired state would be to have all of our external resources that we need available in both English and French. Is it realistic? Potentially not, because we can't dictate to our textbook manufacturers or other material that they must do that. But barring that, perhaps we could get, as a government agency, an exemption from the costs associated with translating where that's unavailable. Because again, it's often cost prohibitive for us to take a textbook and translate even parts of it. And with regards to academic resources, another desired state for us would be to have overall cultural acceptance within our CAF audience of resources that are from outside of their environment, so that they have buy-in and listen to what academia and research is telling them may be successful for our issues internally. So how do we close this gap? How do we get from our current to our desired state? Well, I think we need to improve access to Francophone instructional staff. Part of the problem with our staff is, one, again, they have burnout, so some are reluctant to come back, but also a lot of the units have to sacrifice these members to send them to help with the training. So finding a way to fill the hole at the losing unit so that these members can come and assist us would be a great way to help to close that gap. And also increasing our Francophone support during the training, either through simultaneous translations or French-only syndicates or sessions. We do some of that, but again, it's resource dependent. It takes a lot of personnel hours, and it's very difficult to achieve. And the low numbers often put them at a disadvantage where it often logistically just does not make sense to conduct French-only content. For language training, again, earlier access would start to close that gap, and increased opportunities to reinforce language acquisition. We have in Borden, our official languages section takes great pains to try and offer up chances for people to socialize in French, and lunch and learn sessions. We try to run our meetings bilingual, so people are able to speak whichever official language they choose, and everybody just accepts that. And again, through osmosis, you tend to pick up little pieces and terminology and get more comfortable with it. Again, that's unit dependent though, so perhaps policies that enforce that throughout all of the Canadian Armed Forces would be more beneficial. And again, closing the gap for our academic resources, providing greater access to the reference material in French, and increasing that cultural buy-in. That will start to close our gap. So that's the gap analysis of where we're at. What I wanted to do here to sort of summarize everything before we start to discuss it is to look at this from a SWOT analysis. And I'm not sure if you can give me a thumbs up if you've heard of a SWOT analysis before. Yes, I'm an analyst by nature and profession. So I look at everything to break down factors and try and spell it out and look at it realistically and make sure I'm covering all the bases. But if I look at the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats of how we're integrating language into our training and health services, I'd say that our strength is that we do highly encourage bilingualism. It's always a point of discussion. It's always an issue we're trying to deal with. We already have bilingual internal policy and doctrine available for all our members, and we are running some Franco sessions. Now, our weaknesses, again, because our bilingual numbers are low, it prevents us in being able to increase even more some of the French supports we would like to have. And again, that ties into that lack of suitable instructional staff and the fact that our Franco sessions are so infrequent. Our members are waiting such a very long time. Opportunities here, though, if we look at it from if we can figure this out, we can increase our bilingual population within the CAF. But look at what a role model we could be within the government agencies for linguistic duality. Like, what a great example to set of how to integrate that in. And really, it's an opportunity to provide fair access to timely training. I suspect one of the reasons that we have such a low number of Francophone students that are causing us to have to worry about the Franco sessions is because a lot of them actually probably release before they even get to their first level of training, just out of frustration and having to wait for such a long period of time to become employable in their field. Threats to all of this, again, is that low number of Francophone and allophones. So nature of the beast, we tend to swing to the majority, and the majority tends to be the English needs. So we tend to swing always to those that greater population. And the fact that the language of work is anglicized often further emphasizes that default to the English majority of the working environments in the CAF. And a threat that our civilian resources also are usually Anglophone only, typically because we're also getting them from the US. Even if we get content out of the US military, it's still only going to be in English. So we run into a lot of issues with regards to that. So in discussions that I've had coming into this and talking with Dr. Cooperman, some of the things that we may benefit from as an organization, and this may be a case of I don't know what I don't know. So I'm certainly open to discussion and input from yourselves as to how we could be able to provide better language integration and improve what we're already doing. But research relevant to the military culture, and that would work towards that gap that we try to close with regards to that buy-in. I gave a story often of how deeply ingrained this culture is. We had a team of e-learning developers come to one of our bases and demonstrated avatars for online e-learning program. And it was interesting to watch all of the members in attendance there, because they thought, well, that's all well and good, but it wouldn't work in our environment. So what the programmers did was they went home that night and they changed all the skins on the avatars to put them in military uniforms, came in and presented the exact same content the next day, total buy-in. Everybody wanted it. It was the best thing that ever happened. We can't wait to use this. Our students are going to love it. So that's how deeply ingrained that culture can be. So studies that are done within that culture would definitely get a lot of notice. That being said, experimental studies would be very interesting for health services. If you recall from the mission statement that I presented earlier, we talk about evidence-based. That's huge in healthcare. So experimental studies would then provide some degree of evidence as to what we could do from a language integration standpoint. Training material for our technical vocabulary, again, that's tying in with some of the tendencies for that to become anglicized and being used that way. If I know myself, having learned French, that was difficult enough, but then having to learn medical terminologies in French, I don't even want to go down that road. How do we address that? And any research we would do on second language proficiency under stress and noise would be really beneficial to the CAF. If you think about those pictures I showed at the beginning, ours is not a typical clinical setting, which in of itself is certainly stressful. But when you add in the factor of lack of sleep, combat environment, noise because of weaponry, et cetera, whatever's going off, I can't even imagine the difficulty with which our non-native language speakers are going through trying to understand what's being said to them or what they need to do in that environment under those types of stressors on the job. So that's just a nuts and bolts idea of some of the things I think we could benefit from, but what I'd like to do is turn it over to yourselves and maybe to the moderator. I can't see the chat, so perhaps if there's things there that people would like to ask questions about for clarification or to provide some input or guidance that I may be able to bring back to my organization and put that into a program eval standpoint. I would welcome that now.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. With that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question that you would like to ask Ms. Plante, please use the Zoom live chat to indicate that you have a question, and I'll invite you in turn to unmute your microphone and deliver your question orally. Alternatively, of course, you can enter your full question into the chat, and I'm happy to deliver your question for you. Oh, Jordan, go ahead.
Great, that was really fascinating. I didn't expect to be reminded so much of experiences I've had in the past, given that it's in such a different domain. So I've done a bit of work overseas as an English teacher, which is probably not that surprising. But what this really reminds me of is cases where I was teaching at public schools in Japan, for example, where we had like a school with about 1,000 students in it, and about 50 of them are like newly immigrated students. So their families, like you kind of alluded to this problem where the family moves, the father can speak Japanese and he has no trouble at work, but then the family somehow has to, make it by in everyday life in a new country with a new language. So it's tricky because they don't have enough students, just as you have outlined, they don't have enough students to have a dedicated English language, Japanese language course to kind of on-ramp all of these new students. So they have to kind of play it by ear. So it was funny because in my classroom, it's kind of a level playing field. Everybody's learning a new language for the first time. So that was kind of a nice bonding experience. But what I noticed was that, you just have students just suddenly thrown into a classroom where they don't speak any Japanese at all and just expected to keep up somehow, like they would just soak it up eventually. So of course, that has really negative effects, not only on that student themselves, they already feel very out of place, but it's always painfully aware, like all the other students are always painfully aware of how difficult this student is finding it to just be comfortable in the class. So I guess I'm aware of some of the emotional issues. One thing that I could share from that was that, so again, we're dealing with like very, very limited resources here. So one thing that they did do that seemed really helpful was that they had like a counselor for that area, and they were involved in all of the school districts in like a quite a large area, and they would come to the school once a week to talk with individual students. So every student had about an hour of time, and it was usually done outside the classroom. There was no simultaneous translation, but they would give like kind of ongoing support, and not just for language, but more just being someone that they could talk to about stuff. Because of course they did have their Japanese class, but it was kind of this like after hours support. So if they had questions, they could ask. If they just needed to talk about something, they could help with something too. And I was just wondering if sorry for that really long preamble, but the follow-up question would be like, how much support? I don't know the right word to use. I don't know. I don't speak military, but should I be saying troops?
I speak both civilian and military, so phrase it however you wish.
Should I call them students? So
Absolutely.
Okay, so students, troop students. Like what kind of support are they getting after training hours, like when they're not in the classroom?
That's a great question, and I would say, outside of the collegial relationship, like I talked about that environment and how they're all sort of integrated together, outside of that environment, not much, to be quite frank. So, I mean, that's an interesting idea. And sometimes if we can't solve a problem and we just recognize it's going to be tough for somebody, maybe that is, the better, or not the better solution, but maybe that is one of many solutions, is to provide some counseling for that support. I hadn't even thought of that actually. So that's really interesting. Because typically, from what I've experienced in a classroom makeup, so let's say you have 24 students, you usually have 2 to 3 that are really struggling with the English language, and this is on an English course. You rarely see it on English people taking the French courses. They don't have to, so you rarely see it. Yeah. So what ends up happening is there's usually about 3 or 4 on the course who are fluently bilingual, and end up becoming the counselor, so to speak, and really helping that other person through. So it starts early on that we actually burn out our fluently bilingual members even before they finish their training. But having resources available for people to speak with would probably be very beneficial for their mental well-being, definitely. And that would increase satisfaction too. So that's a great suggestion. I like that.
I've been in similar situations myself where I was, I've done a lot of volunteer work, so I've kind of ended up being launched into a completely immersive situation. And in those cases, I have had like individual people that could help me translate, and I was kind of rapidly trying to learn the language. But one thing that does happen is that you can start to feel like a burden because you're always having to rely on the same people. So they're the people that are always having to step in and kind of help you out. And it's not that great, especially when that role isn't defined like strictly. Whereas if there's someone who has the role of a counselor, or you don't need to, whatever term would be most appropriate in the military to make people not feel like they're, any kind of way. And I guess the other follow-up point is I was going to ask, but I know Victor has a question, but this is a short one. Just to what degree do these different students interact with each other across language groups outside? Like, are they having like hockey matches where it's like the Francophones versus the English speaking like students, that kind of thing? Does that happen?
I suspect it would. I think like in any environment where you have people living together in close quarters for extended period of times, you're going to have cliques or groups form. And the old adage, birds of a feather flock together, right? So we're going to naturally gather with people who are like us, and communication is so crucial to everything that I think if the leadership were to encourage more external collaboration with their student colleagues that are outside of their language comfort zone, then that would probably help, because likely you're going to default. I think humans are lazy inherently. We want to be able to communicate quickly, especially after being uncomfortable all day long and learning. So I suspect that they're probably sticking within their comfort zone for their language groups.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
I don't know. I don't know that I would see them pitting themselves English versus French on purpose, because we try to remove that type of friendly competition, because it could create barriers potentially.
Of course, yeah.
But I think it probably does happen, unintendedly. But yeah.
I mean, I've had some successes. Develop, like I started a bilingual basketball team. And then a volleyball team at 2 different schools that I worked at. And that was really great, especially for the students that were the minority group, because they were left out of conversations because they lack the language. But like those kind of organized events level the playing field. I mean, there isn't a huge language component, and the language component that is there is easy to learn. So it can be a really great way for just to make people, because when you're in the minority and you're kind of cut off from being able to connect with people like verbally, adding those other kinds of ways to level the playing field can have really positive effects.
That's a great suggestion. Like I said, and definitely encouraging more of that would be beneficial all around. And I think it would reduce stress, but improve teamwork at the same time. So that's excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah, cool.
So
glad to help.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jordan. Next, we have a comment from Dr. Cooperman.
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much. Looking at the slide that is now open, experimental studies and technical vocabulary development, these are things that we can help with. This is what we do as linguists. To give an example, there are vocabulary building exercises for the medical profession, nursing, paramedics, and so on. So they exist. And I guess the actual question is, all of this will require, actually, it's the chicken and the egg situation as far as the cultural buy-in happens, right? So for us to bring something that would be accepted by the military, we would need to adjust these, say, exercises or tools or experiments for the military context, which will require that someone lets us in and allows us to play in the sandbox along with the members, along with the students, and make the adjustment. What do you think is the best way to facilitate that?
I think the best thing, any research involving human subjects goes through REB process within the CAF, just as it would through any academic institution. And what I could do is provide you with those points of contacts for that. It's, again, we're the government, right? So we change our names constantly, or our acronyms for what who does what, but it's Director Military Human Research, I believe, is the organization in Ottawa. So anytime we would have any research that is specific to certain elements of human subjects, it has to go through them for REB approval. We have, as a training institution, we have some exemptions from that with regards to the training environment and program eval, et cetera. Like, so for example, if I want to ask course evaluations of the candidates, of our students, of how their learning went, how they like their teacher, et cetera, like you would at a university, I don't need to go through REB approval for that. That's just part of the way we do business for a training environment. So it would really depend, to answer your question, it would really depend on the scope of what you wanted to research. And I think the best thing, you can always go to the human research department and present it, and they'll tell you whether or not it needs REB approval or whether it can just go straight to the institutions. And ours is just one. I just want to clarify, like, we're health services. We're just one small branch of the whole CAF. You have, all your Army specific training, Navy, Air Force, et cetera, other logistics trades that support the operations. So again, there's lots of different venues or avenues with which you could go down this road for doing research, but that would be where I would start, would be to talk to them and engage with them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next, there is a comment question from Dr. Gary Libin. Gary, would you like to unmute yourself?
You're muted.
Hello, hi, good to see you again, and thank you for the really interesting talk. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. I also have a really a comment, and that is I'm really struck by. I really got a lot out of your presentation. Again, thank you so much. One thing that struck me was that those things that we do as psycholinguists for completely different reasons, you could perhaps employ. So let me give you an example. To test people's vocabulary processing, we often try to present words under conditions of noise or extremely briefly. And our purpose, of course, is not to simulate any combat environment. We're trying to do this so that people could not develop strategic activities that would lead them to, basically figure out what the experiment's about. And so if you create time pressure and you build in noise and a few other things, you solve some experimental problem. But we have a whole battery of things that that measure very, very precisely how quickly someone can understand words of any sort in English and in French, any other language, under conditions of noise, under conditions of speed. You can vary those things. I could imagine that if I were one of your students, I would actually have a little bit of fun trying to, because I could gauge myself, you see. So I might think that I know a whole bunch of words in both English and French, but it's quite a separate question. Would I be able? How quickly could I get them at them? Under what conditions of distraction would I be able to process them? And then I get a different kind of measure of my relative strength in English and in French. I'm sure I would find that I might think that I speak French, but I'd probably be quite challenged under conditions of stress.
I think you're right, and I know that a lot of what we do, because training is so inherent to everything we do in the military, we train and train and train, because if you're not fighting, you're training. That's basically the ideology. That what we often see happen is people get so accustomed to the patterns of the job, so they don't necessarily need the communication triggers, as opposed to they just know what's going to happen next and they react to the situation as opposed to the words. So what you were talking about there, under the noise and the stress and duress, a perfect example of that is when we teach drill. So drill is basically when you see people marching in formation on parades or in the battlefield sometimes, perhaps. You can take most military members, if they're English, and you put them on a French base and do parade. The calls would all be in French, but because they've trained in it so much and they know what the next expected movement is, they can react to the sound as opposed to what the actual word is saying, because they know what to predict. It's predictable. So I think oftentimes in what you were saying is true, that our ability to develop the language in our students is limited to that predictability. If we step outside of that, would they do as well? Probably not. So it's an interesting field for sure. But then maybe that's the solution too.
If I may try a quick follow-up. This is, I think, where we would need, in order, let's just say, it'd be possible for us to make a contribution. This is where we need a lot of guidance on the cultural buy-in. So, for example, we might think naively that, if you gamify this would make it great, because I could, turn it into a kind of game. But how do I know that's exactly what would be? How do I know that wouldn't be precisely the wrong way to go? Be off-putting for some reason that I would not know for cultural reasons. So you really need that cultural help to make the contribution that you want.
Absolutely. And gamification, I will say, in the training development environment in the Canadian Forces is huge right now. Definitely, there's been cases where we've taken Call of Duty platforms and superimposed our environments on top of it and used that as a way to introduce people to the combat environment before actually getting out in the field. Simulation can reduce the actual hours of hands-on practice needed, right? So we try to use that to the maximum possible. But even within our culture, there's subcultures. So because gamification and that environment in the combat arms profession is very well received. Now, when I worked with the military chaplains, not. So we introduced gamification into some of their training, and they were rather put off by it, saying, don't insult my intelligence, just give me what I need to learn, etc. I don't want to play these games, I just want to learn that content. So cultural buy-in is just scratching the surface. It's the first start is to just be relevant to the military, and even then you have to dive in deeper and find the little subcultures within that. So definitely. Not to complicate things for you, sorry.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
That's funny. As soon as Gary started talking, I was imagining like a Call of Duty style,
Yeah.
like a vocabulary test.
Oh yeah.
But that's not surprising to me. I play a lot of those kind of games, and a lot of the people I play with are in the military, so that is kind of familiar to me. I did have another question. If nobody else wants to, okay, I'll let Sarah go first, and then I'll save my question for after.
Thank you, Jordan. I have a question, which is just, do you know of any existing sort of partnership collaborations that exist between the CAF and academic institutions like ourselves? And do you know what the process is to kind of get those partnerships in place, if you know of any?
We have a number of them. To be frank, there are quite a few. So let me think about that for a second. So a lot of times we've had articulation agreements with, for example, for our physician assistant with the University of Nebraska, they would confer a degree on our students from their institution based on our training. So they would come and observe it, et cetera. We have other agreements where we would send our students for partial completion of courses and use that in lieu of our training. University of Manitoba, for example, has a huge equivalencies database that they refer to for members who wish to do a basic, not a basic, but an undergraduate degree. They can apply for equivalencies for training that they've already had or completed, and they've looked at what we've done and given out credits accordingly with that. There are numbers of, there's a department in Ottawa, I don't know it offhand right now, but I know it exists, where we look at different college university programs, particularly for our skilled trades, and we look at what's in there and see what we can grant in our training as an equivalency. So it goes both ways. So we look and say, okay, you came from Algonquin College, you're an electrician, you want to be a military electrician, here's what we will grant you based on what you've had from Algonquin, for example. So that does exist. We have commissioned some institutions. I don't know necessarily about universities, but I can't see why not. But I have seen white papers or other major research reports that have been promulgated through our department that have been commissioned to organizations external to ourselves to conduct research on our behalf and make recommendations. Again, those would all go up through National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa. If you have a question and specifically want to know where, you can get my contact information from the organizers here today, and I'll do my best to try and pinpoint a point of contact. As you can imagine, it's just quite a tangled web of offices and bureaucracies to try and figure out who does what where, but being internal, I can try my best to see if I can sort that out. So I hope that answers your question.
Very nice.
Okay.
So Jordan, there are just 2 minutes left. If you'd like to continue with your follow-up, you're welcome to.
Okay, well, maybe I'll try and find a shorter one. I have a long list of questions. I'll try and pick. Okay, so sure. I guess one of the things that I noticed that one of the big issues, of course, if you had infinite resources, then that'd be, you could do whatever you wanted. But it seems like there's a lack of numbers when it comes to Francophone courses. So they get so if you have to wait for a very long time if you want to take a Francophone only course. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Typically.
So I guess. Yeah, okay. And I guess unless you're lucky and you happen to sign up, you're like the last one to sign up.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So I guess one just from thinking from their perspective, because I've been in similar situations, it can feel like you're being punished for being a French speaker in this case, right? And I guess the implicit nudge is that, oh, well, if only you learned English a bit faster, then you would be able to take the courses, because it seems like that's in fact what people end up doing.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking there was that one way to at least kind of reduce that feeling of being left out because of who you are that you can't control. I guess during COVID, you've probably been developing a lot of online resources, things like that. And I was wondering, the question was, if someone wants to sign up for a Francophone only course, are they given some course materials ahead of time so that they don't feel like they're just waiting, they're just able to work on something beforehand so they can maybe get ahead, and then when the course starts, it's easier for them, or maybe they've finished some of the components already?
If your question is, has that been happening? I can say no. Should it? Probably. It's a good idea. One of the things that we've been trying to look at is alternate pathways of learning. So beyond just merely everybody attending training from start to finish as a cohort and then going on, how do we break this down into smaller modules? How do we use micro-learning, on-the-job training, et cetera? And that would tie into what you're saying there then. You know, if we make resources available in the official language of the member's choice, and they're able to work through it on their own and demonstrate proficiency, can we use that in lieu of? You know, definitely. I think that's where you were going with that question, or?
Yeah, and even have it be combined, because I'm sure that there's things that happen during the classroom time that's maybe not replaceable,
Yes.
and maybe you wouldn't want to replace. But at least it gives people the chance to start working on stuff. So it doesn't, instead of saying, oh yeah, okay, well, if you want to take a French only course, well, you have to wait a year. It's like, oh, you want to take a French only course? Cool, you can start next week. But this other component of the course will come much later on. But at least they can, like, it feels a lot better to be working towards something, even if it's only gradually, than it is to be waiting for something to happen.
That's, you know what, that's a good idea. We could probably set that up easily. Again, the development of our courseware is the process that takes the longest, but you know, surely we can look at our adult learners and say, okay, they can be somewhat self-directed with some of this content and make it available to them. And then they could reach back to the school at certain points if they have questions or queries, et cetera, and then save that piece. And actually COVID has been a bit of a silver lining in the cloud, so to speak, because it's forced us to have to do that and think a little bit more lean with bringing people in because of the restrictions. So I think that we're probably going to naturally start to move towards that type of a model, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. And I like that suggestion very much, actually. So something I might have to put that into some of my recommendations. I'll give full credit. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks a lot. I'm just glad to be helpful.
That's great. Thank you.
So sorry to interrupt. Ms. Plante, do you have time for one more question?
I do, absolutely. That's no problem.
Okay, Heather, I'd like to ask you to unmute yourself to deliver your question orally at this time.
Hi, Sandra. I was wondering if the French training courses have ever been used as a type of like immersion course for the English recruits as well, to help them build up the French skills, but also to increase the number of people who are taking the French training program, and then maybe have the courses happen more often?
That would be a great initiative. Unfortunately, like I was saying, though, a lot of times getting on language training is very difficult, and it happens later in somebody's career. So they're presumably done their occupational training. But I think your suggestion would be fantastic, and it would really improve that linguistic duality. If we could get more English people on the French courses, and then again, reinforce those skills by saying, okay, now that you've had your French course, you're going to go take your occupational training in French. Then that would definitely help to reinforce it. The way our training system is set up right now, though, is that the choice is on the member of what they would like to do their training in. So I think in theory, it would be fabulous, and I would actually really like to see that, but I fear that a lot of our students would choose their native language just out of comfort and this desire to do well. But yeah, you know, definitely, I think, and the sad thing is really, it's not written explicitly, but in order to get ahead in your career, you really need to have that second language profile, whether a Francophone with English or an Anglophone with French. So it's really important to have that to get ahead, but we make it so difficult for people to actually get ahead in order to get those opportunities that, you know, sometimes we're our own worst enemy where it comes to that integration. But that's an interesting concept that I hadn't thought of, and it would definitely reinforce that linguistic duality, I think.
And I think from the troops perspective, it would be a kind of marketing push on maybe your end or the languages branch, and to say like, hey, rather than doing your language training and then getting your occupational training, like here's a way to fast track, and it's kind of helping them to see the incentive behind it rather than going for everybody's automatic default of, my native language is easier. And
absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny because I remember years ago, we had we just recently reopened our other college. We have the Royal Military College, which is our university for our military members. And we do civilian universities as well, but we have Royal Military College, which is an English institution. We used to have Collège Militaire Royal de Quebec, which is CMR, was the French version. And in the 90s, we used to channel a lot of our students that were Anglophone to CMR to do their university. And it helped to improve their linguistic ability, as you were saying, Heather. So that was good. Now they closed it up, budget cuts. I mean, the military is always at the mercy of the governing parties. So budget cuts, they cut down CMR, and they just recently reintegrated it as an institution. So I'm really hoping that maybe something to what you were saying will eventually take place. And that would definitely make strides towards that integration. But for the last 20 years, though, it's been definitely a gaping hole.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Heather, for that question. I'd like to close our open office hour now. Thank you so much to our speaker, Sandra Plante, for your presentation today and for taking our questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us. If you have a comment or question about today's open office hour, please feel free to send it to wordsintheworldgrant@gmail.com. We'll have a recorded version of this talk on our website via the open office hours page, and that's wordsintheworld.ca. You'll also find announcements of future open office hours and resources related to previous open office hours there. So keep an eye on that page. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Plante. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.